This is the Gang of Witches Ibiza podcast, hosted by Joe Yule. Each new moon, we'll explore with our guests how to think globally and act locally with ecofeminism. Awaken all your senses. The spirit of the witches comes to your ears. The Sabbath is that way. Gang of
Welcome back to the Gang of Witches Ibiza podcast with me, Joe Yule, and today we catch up with screenwriter, novelist and environmental activist Rebecca Frayn. 2 years ago, Rebecca released Misbehaviour, a revolutionary feminist feature film on the 1970s Miss World protests by the women's liberation movement. The furore interrupted a live TV broadcast and in turn sparked so many conversations that put women's lib on the map at a time when so many of those issues we are dealing with today were mostly unheard, like the Me Too movement. Keira Knightley and Gugu Mbatha-Raw both star in the film, which was nominated last year for Best British Film, and it's a story told about women by women, and one which took 10 years of investigative digging to fully uncover. Plus, we're going to be hearing about her new book, Heatwave, which is set in Ibiza, that I'm almost finished, and her work on The Lady, a film about Aung San Suu Kyi that came out just over 10 years ago, about the Burmese Nobel Peace Prize laureate. Rebecca, thank you so much for joining me here on the Gang of Witches Ibiza podcast.
I'm so delighted to be here. Thank you very much for asking me.
Can we just start with the inspiration behind your latest film, or the catalyst, which led to the activism that created a story that I think, caught your attention in such a way that you felt compelled to dig up the details that had all but been buried by a lack of papers remaining on it, and a story that you felt should be made into a full-blown film?
Yeah, so the film Misbehaviour was a perfect story for me. I just happened to hear on Radio 4 an interview between the original demonstrators and some of the original organisers of the Miss World competition. And all my career, I've tried to make stories that showcase women with agency. I'm turning 60 this year, so I was born in 1962, so I grew up in pretty dark ages for women, and we were very invisible. I mean, in 1970, when that film was set, I think 2% of women in the UK were MPs. Women really didn't appear in public unless they were wearing, a chiffon dress or a bikini on the Miss World show, and were being fetishized for their looks. So when I heard this debate about, I was only 8 when the demonstration happened, when the women got into the Miss World show. So I don't actually remember it happening, but it definitely unleashed a wave of kind of mischief and rebellious spirit that coloured the times, and definitely I came of age off that. And I was like, oh my God, here enshrined is a spectacle. So I tell stories in different forums, and if it's a very internal story, then I will choose to write it in a novel. But this was a spectacle, so I just immediately thought, I've got to find a way of doing this. Looking into it, I realised it was the year that the women's movement was actually formally founded in the UK at Oxford at the beginning of that year. I had no idea. This is our history, and it had never been taught to me, and that really galvanises me to. So then, this is a story for women about their own history. We need to know it. We can't understand ourselves if we don't know what shaped us. And I'm also kind of, a little bit like, why do these stories disappear? And it's because, even at that stage, 10 years ago, there were still relatively few women storytellers. And, of course, it takes a woman to find that story interesting and to really want to dig deep and to tell it with integrity. I couldn't find a lot of the material. So as you say, it just was no one had bothered to record it. The women who got into the Miss World competition in 1970, 5 of them were arrested. They went to Bow Street Court, which was the famous magistrates' court in London, and they decided to put the patriarchy in the dock. So this was a whole magnificent historical event I'd never heard of. I go to the archive base. Oh, we threw it all away. You threw away women putting the patriarchy in the dock for 3 days. I mean, that my first instinct was, that's the film. All of that gone because no one cared, because no one thought it was important. So the harder it got, the more determined I became. And once I had the BFI of the British Film Institute agreed to fund me. It was fronted by a woman, she got it. And it was also a multicultural story. It was the first year that a Black Miss World won, played by Gugu Mbatha-Raw, who's absolutely fantastic in the film. We then struggled to finance it. I mean, really, to be honest, people paid lip service, but they still, feature films were, I can't, you'll know the famous test of, it's two a women cartoonists put together the something test, the Schödegrich test. I can't remember. I never remember what it's called. But it's they rated films where that had 2 named women in them who talked about anything other than men, and it was something like 4% of feature films passed the test. So you go into meetings, because I was producing it as well as writing it, with potential sponsors, and they kind of paid lip service to how important this was that this film got out there, but you could see that they were always men, they didn't really get it. And what really changed was about halfway through that process, the Me Too movement happened, and pizzam, it suddenly became a zeitgeist project overnight. And this term, the patriarchy, which has seemed very stale and moribund, suddenly was back in currency again. And from that point, Pathé bought it, who have made many social history films. And we brought in Philippa Lowthorpe, who's a very talented director who'd done a lot of documentary verite work. And so the project was a go project, and it would have been a triumphant story. We opened in every cinema in the UK, and 3 days later lockdown came. And so we closed in every cinema in the country. So throughout lockdown, on every high street in every city in the country, you could pass a cinema that said Misbehaviour, but you couldn't get in there.
Coming to a cinema nowhere near you. That's interesting what you say about putting the patriarchy in the dock. I mean, how would you describe what that looked like? Because I gather, these women were causing kind of like anarchy at Bow Street Magistrates Court, where I actually have spent quite a lot of time in the past myself as a journalist in London, so it kind of rang a bit of a bell. Obviously it looked a lot different in the 1970s, but it was interesting, the way they kind of ran amok and created this amazing scene where women were really up for making a really big mark, really, I think, on trying to get that storyline and that narrative into the mainstream.
So absolutely, it was the first direct action that women had taken since the suffragettes, and that really blew my mind. I mean, by that stage, I'd done quite a lot of environmental activism, and so I really had done a lot of thinking about how you create social change, how you put a movement on the map, and of course, the suffragettes did it in all kinds of extraordinary ways that changed history and changed our lives for the better, and we owe them a great debt. And for some of those women, as we know, it actually meant being in prison and force-fed, and one woman died under the hooves of a horse, and this was real sacrifice that some of this direct action took. So I was really struck that for 100 years since then, women had remained, having made that great gain to be able to vote, relatively invisible, had relatively only recently been allowed to attend universities, and then even more recently than that to actually be given the degree that they had worked so hard for. So for me, if you're 60, these are very fresh. It's not ancient history. So I was really excited by the idea of telling a story in which women take direct action. And my environmental group that I had been collaborated with were all women. And I think that you can't be what you don't see. And if we can, I just felt that even so late in the day, in millennial days, we were still not seeing active women role models. I mean, they're coming through the Angela Merkels, Christine Lagarde, slowly, but it's slow. So I that was what excited me very much about it, and also that it was direct action with mischief and humour. They had an immense amount of fun and anarchy, so it wasn't angry and it wasn't alienating. And of course, once Me Too happened, then things like Extinction Rebellion started to occur, which had a kind of kinship with the spirit in which those early women's activists were operating in the 70s.
But I think, as you just pointed out there, the suffragettes were the ones that, got the kind of legal vote happening. And that was kind of seen as like the first wave of feminism. But the second wave was all about this kind of, equal rights, equal opportunities and more greater personal freedom for women. I mean, how do you think that was kind of reflected in that film specifically?
Well, the film begins with the Ruskin Conference, which was a conference organised by women at the beginning of 1970 and attended by far more women than they ever expected to arrive, it was the first conference dedicated to women's issues, where only women spoke. They covered up, in the beautiful room in which they were gathering, there were lots of statues of eminent men throughout history, and they began by covering them up with either banana skins or handkerchiefs, and it was it was women taking a forum, talking about their history, about what needed to be done, and it ended with 5 demands about what the way forward for women's emancipation. And so it was a clear, concise forum in which women mobilised for the first time, and we see that happen. And then the event of the Miss World competition became the first event that we see them mobilise on. And what was so clever was that it went out on live television. It was the highest rated show in the world, and so if you could, as they did, get your message out in front of those cameras. I call it the Gollywog Moment. It's the moment that people, were gathering thinking it was this really anodyne, like Love Island. It was equivalent of Love Island at its time. Harmless show with women in beautiful ball gowns. And I have to remind anyone listening who's not my age that this was a time on that show where you were basically celebrated for the size of your breast, your waist and your hip. You were a blonde or you were a brunette. And if you got down to the final 6, I think it was, you came out in a swimming costume, and the contestants were asked to turn to show their backside to the camera, and the studio camera slowly trundled along so that everyone at home, and it was going out around the world, could decide who they thought had the best backside. So when the women's movement got in and they said this is a cattle market and this is outrageous, and they came in dressed there were 2 women dressed as a cow, it was that moment of, oh my God, they're right. I mean, this is absolutely outlandish. Why are we parading women for the size of their breasts, the colour of their hips, the shape of their backside? I mean, nothing was ever the same again. And it took a few years, but the BBC became more and more embarrassed about it and dropped it. And it didn't directly lead to the equal pay bill, but it helped shift a climate of, in which views change, a new zeitgeist. It helped usher in a new zeitgeist, but it did it with humour, and I loved that.
What do you think about the fact that, just on the 28th of March then, that another Miss World has just been crowned?
Well, it was all repackaged by, the show in those days was run by a husband and wife team called Eric and Julia Morley. Eric Morley was very much old school, very much, that women should be virgins, that they should be, that they should represent sort of graceful ideals, be essentially passive. It was left to Julia Morley after the demonstration in 1970, and the show sort of suddenly being highlighted as very much out of step with the times that were changing. She created this idea of beauty with a purpose. And so I think, I haven't seen more recent shows, but I think there's more emphasis on doing good work and, being a professional. I think also that women now are seen in a much wider forum. So I think that the whole context has changed. So it's not something I much care for, but as long as I'm seeing women be politicians, as long as I'm seeing women be activists, as long as I'm seeing women, working in banking, it worries me less. It's part of a whole spectrum of how women are being seen in the public forum. When it's the main way, as it was in the 1970s, I think it has very dark and sinister overtones. And for me, at 8, in the year that show was invaded, it was literally like shades of the prison house being blown up. Because, if you were 8, you were... it's a really strange feeling. It's going to matter, what my figure is like. It's going to matter whether I'm a blonde or a brunette. And that is going to be the limit of my potential in the world. It was very thrilling to see that exploded. And I think now, because women have so many more potentials, it really makes it less of a political issue, the fact that there is one forum in which women are being judged for their looks. And I'm sure there is still a Mr. Universe. So I think men are also being systematically deconstructed and made to, have dysmorphia issues because they've got their own show now too.
Mm. I mean, yeah, it's all a bit nauseating and very superficial, and ultimately, being judged for, our body shape and our exterior is really just quite a depressing thing in general. And obviously women just basically, learning from a very young age from this kind of farcical kind of, peripheral image that we see on Instagram and social media, and that's as good as we're supposed to measure up to. And I think it's not healthy. But I think it's interesting also that Hollywood made history in 2020, the year Misbehaviour landed, with a record number of films from female directors. But after achieving that milestone, the film business found itself regressing last year, with women comprising just 17% of directors, and the top 250 grossing movies was down 18% from the previous year. So the picture grows darker when the focus narrows to the top 100 most popular movies at the box office, with women making up 12% of directors on those films, down from 16% the year before. So how has it been to be, this isn't just the only film you've made. You've made lots of films, including the one I want to talk about in a moment with Aung San Suu Kyi, about her life story, called The Lady. And I think I'd love to hear from your perspective, like what challenges you faced along the way, or why specifically you've wanted to focus on women's stories.
It came into the film business in the 80s, and it became very clear to me that all the feminist ideas that I'd come of age on, those days, the thinkers were like Germaine Greer, Gloria Steinem, the great sort of icons of the day. So I embarked on the working world full of idealism and energy and determination. And I realised that the systems really, really were weighted still against women. And so the first thing I did, after my degree, I went and trained in the cutting rooms. I thought to get a sort of technical craft, because I really, at that stage, my what I wanted to do and what I did do for 15 years was to be a documentary director. So I thought, let's really give weight and heft to what I have to offer. So I got a craft basis. I went to the BBC and I was trained there. And I saw how few women directors there were, and how few women writers there were, and how few women producers. And clubs, elites are self-reinforcing. You give jobs to the people like you, which was white middle-class men gave jobs to white middle-class men. And they might pay liberal lip service, but nothing was changing. So it only occurred to me when I left the BBC that I could make a virtue out of that. The stories that I saw, all these stories that weren't being told because men didn't find them interesting. They just simply didn't see them. And so in a way I thought, well, that's what I'm going to embrace. That's my agenda. So I initially I made stories about women artists who weren't being represented, like Nora Ephron. There was a very successful art show called the South Bank Show, and it was all about men writing, men painting. So, I persuaded the editor, Melvyn Bragg, to make a film about Annie Leibovitz, who was, seminal, who's had, helped shape cultural history. And then, that film went down well, and I went back and he persuaded him to make a film on Nora Ephron, who was, remains one of the great sort of women, funny writers with a sort of sharp feminine eye. It was extraordinary that no one had made a film about her. I persuaded Channel 4 to make a film about Leni Riefenstahl, very controversial, filmmaker, working with Hitler, but making these extraordinary films. How had no one made a film about her 50 years on? It was incredible to me. I mean, it just gave me such an appetite and a determination that these women are not being seen. And I personally want pathfinders, and I think that the women around me, we all need pathfinders to see that women are doing it, and they have unique perspectives. Let's explore them. And so then as I started to diversify on from directed documentaries to screenwriting, I came across the story. I was travelled in Burma, actually, is what happened. And on a very grim week with the government, you had to have a government minder there, and you had to stay in government hotel. And they tried to sort of stop you seeing anything they didn't want you to see. But Aung San Suu Kyi had just been put under house arrest. And what people wanted to tell us when the government minder was out of earshot was that their only hope was this woman who'd been put under house arrest. So again, when I came back, it's like, why is no one talking? This is as I started to watch her, this has become more complicated, but for a long while, she was really of the status of Gandhi and Mandela. Why was no one telling that story? So, okay, all right, here's a challenge. And it's kind of thrilling, to be given a clear agenda and to make a positive out of a negative.
It's so interesting that you say that, because I had literally never heard of Aung San Suu Kyi, and even that name, I was like, how am I going to pronounce that for the next month of my life? Because I just started a radio station at the Brighton Festival, and that year, Andrew Comben, the director of the festival, decided to bring her in as the guest artistic director. And at the point of her being released from house arrest, we were like, oh my God, she's going to actually come and be here through that course of that month. And then, of course, in 2011, she got taken back in again, and everyone was devastated. And actually, a lot of the team from the Brighton Festival, in secret, had been over to visit her and recorded a lot of her words. And we actually managed to get some of those bits of her voice into the programming of the radio station. And it was so incredible to hear her speak. But, when I obviously then investigated her story further, it was actually really heartbreaking to see that, she obviously didn't get to re-meet her husband or see her children for all those years, and obviously the death of her husband. And I think, that story for a woman who was forced to make a choice between her family and, remaining in the country that needed her most. It's, as you say, I mean, an iconic figure, but what a story. And the fact that you made a film on it, I think is very powerful, because I just don't think a lot of people really, know about her, and knowing what's going on in that country right now and seeing all these horrific, I mean, it is devastating to see what's happening there. And I just wonder, what was it about that story that made you, obviously after you'd been there in 1990, think, this is it, I've got to get this on the wider screen.
So, yes, having travelled there in 1990, the years passed. She was under house arrest. Nothing was happening. There seemed to be no movement that made one optimistic that she was going to be released. And as you say, she'd had to choose, because she could have left. The strange, extraordinary thing about her story is she could have left at any time, as long as she agreed to get on a plane and go back to Oxford, where she'd left her then 12 and 14-year-old son and her husband, Michael Eris. But she would never have been allowed back to her homeland. So it was an odd story of captivity. To some extent, there was a choice, and in a way that made it even more extraordinary. She sometimes, initially, her children were allowed to come and see her and her husband, and then they stopped those visits, trying to ramp up the pressure. So I was just really moved. As I say, I think that there were really strong parallels with Nelson Mandela and Gandhi in terms of the principles that she embodied. But there was she was a woman, and I think there was a unique feminine angle, which is that she had to leave a 12 and 14-year-old son to be raised by her husband. And as you say, was having to choose between her country and the fight for democracy or her family. And I think that that's a unique choice that a Gandhi or a Mandela would never have had to make, because men would just be assumed would choose the principle. And many people judged her for the fact that she had left her family. So it was a quintessentially female story. And so the film, when I wrote it, was a lobbying film because she was under house arrest. And I was told, I wrote to her in University Avenue where she was under house arrest. But I was told that no, I would never know whether she'd received the letter, and I'd never receive a response. So I wanted to tell her about the project. And when the director, Luc Besson, came on board, he financed it, so it became instantly a Go project. And I had come to know her family, her British family, very, very well. So I had their blessing for the film, and I'd really done a lot of research. And they'd been very generous, shared correspondence with me. And actually, very movingly, Michael Eris had an identical twin brother, Anthony, who became a great friend, who's extraordinary, wonderful, now died, sadly. And I'm the mother of identical twins, so he thought that I would, one of the reasons he agreed to talk to me, he thought I would have unique understanding. And one of the first things that he told me when I met him was that when Aung San Suu Kyi discovered that her husband was dying, they applied, I think it was 46 times, to the Burmese authorities to beg for permission that he could come and say goodbye. And they kept saying, you can leave, you can go back to Oxford, but no, he can't come. And she knew that was the end, that was the end. She would have to give up the fight for democracy, and there was no one else fighting for democracy. So she couldn't. So she went to the British Embassy and they recorded a farewell film. And she thanked him for their children, for their marriage, and then she breaks down and she leaves Fraim. So there were all these extraordinary aspects to the story, that no one had told, that gave sort of great humanity and depth to the stories, sorry, I'm making you cry. But these are, the human courage, it's so lost, and that we and the great power of storytellers, if you can do it right, is to make people have a heart connection, right? And it's a heart connection that makes us care and inspires us to take action. And what can we each do in our own lives, that helps make a change. So that's what galvanised me.
Sorry, just having an emotional moment there. Can't really imagine what that feels like to have to to say goodbye to your husband on a piece of film footage. It's just it is heartbreaking to understand what she had to go through. And I just, you kind of wonder when you look at what's actually happening there now, and you think, well, what, is that ever going to make a change? That huge, enormous sacrifice doesn't seem to have changed anything. And it's kind of how you feel when you dip into what's happening in the Ukraine. And I think it's the same sense of what your son is obviously making a film about with the eco-anxiety. It's well, how much of this knowledge and constant feeling of not, feeling helpless and unable to change things, is that part of a storyline that we are able to be part of, but how deeply can we get involved in that to change the story? And I think it's difficult to know how deeply to connect into these kinds of situations, because obviously you have to protect yourself, but equally you need to engage and play your part, which you have done through various courses of activism. When did you become, when did you realise that you really wanted to do something for the climate, for the planet?
Oh, that's a good question, and I feel quite ashamed of the answer, so you have to forgive me what I'm confessing. So I came to an environmental awareness really very late. I think I was in my late 30s, early 40s, and what happened was I was a documentary filmmaker, and I made a short film to be released virally on YouTube, campaigning against the expansion of Heathrow, which is the largest airport in the world. And it's just outside, close to where I live in West London. And in the same year that the British government committed to a certain reduction in their carbon emissions, they also committed to expanding this airport and wiping out single-handedly the commitment they just made. So in making that short film, and it was a very short film, in which my kids appeared, because I happened to shoot it during school holidays, and so I was filming with a lot of other kids, and I put them in. It was just a sort of practical thing. I started to read a lot, and I started to understand actually how incredibly serious the situation was, and I just had this epiphany. I thought, I was raising 3 children, so they were 7. I have a 7-year-old daughter then, and I had 14-year-old twin boys. I thought, I cannot believe that I am obsessing about whether they've cleaned their teeth or whether they're getting enough protein, when their whole sense of the future of the planet, their future, and all of their generation's future has such a grave question mark over it. It was just blew me away. And Al Gore at that stage had, I think he made a film, was it, about what will you tell your children? So it's a great, powerful question. What would I, when they were older, and they said to me, what did you do when you understood what was happening? And I say, not much, I worried, That's not an acceptable answer. So I was part of an all-women book club, had sent the link out for this viral film, which is called When I Grow Up. And so they'd all watched it. And for the first time, instead of discussing a book, we discussed climate crisis, which we'd just never discussed before. And we all confessed our sense of impotence and our fear. So we're talking in the 90s, the beginning of the 90s. And they were a group of women artists, journalists, writers. We had really interesting skill sets. And they, in a sense, to my horror, said, right, we're going to have to do something. We're going to roll up our sleeves. And initially, one of them, unbelievably, the journalist, got permission for us to camp on Parliament Green, which is the green just outside the House of Commons, which is the whole basis of power, as you know, in the UK, where all the MPs gather and the Prime Minister. And I don't know how she did it, but it would be like a little Greenham Common women, which is a whole other thing, actually. I want to make a film about Greenham Common women, which we haven't spoken about. But to be honest, my heart went into my boots, because, we all had full-time jobs. I was a full-time writer and filmmaker. I was raising 3 kids. I didn't quite know how I was going to live in this tent and get my kids to school. But I also I really saw that we had to be doing something. So we then rethought it, and we'd basically spent 2 years in the run-up to what was then the COP at Copenhagen, trying to get the agenda on the map. And what was interesting is that we were the first middle-class female group to come through. So Greenpeace immediately came to us and said, we want to help you. They were really thrilled to see a different demographic, a demographic that would appeal to Middle England, that was, very smiley and, non-threatening, and had children. We took our children with us out of practicality to all these vigils. We would stand with placards. We would go into the House of Commons. We went down to Heathrow and had a protest picnic with other groups, environmental groups, because you can't legally have a placard at Heathrow. So you could put the demonstration messages on picnic blankets. That wasn't illegal. And the kids would come with us because I didn't have anyone else to take care of them. I wasn't meaning to radicalise them, but they embodied the future. And it really was an issue about them. And they again, we're talking about heart connection. They make that heart connection. So we were suddenly we got a lot of attention at the time. We were in a lot of newspapers. And to be honest, it was frankly terrifying. I'd deal with police who, when we were holding a new demonstration, would call me, can you guarantee there's going to be no trouble? I said, no trouble. We're bringing our kids. There will be no trouble. But that's not the person I am. I'm not confrontational. I'm not an activist. And the kind of speed with which we were appearing in newspapers and being asked for quotes was, it's not my area of expertise. It also was terrifying that the issue was so off the radar that we could make that kind of traction. And again, that's something that's changed so radically now. I mean, everyone, I think, is aware of the issues now. And now it's more about what can each individual do to contribute them. But we do know about the issues in a way we didn't in the 90s. And the weirdest, most unexpected consequences that you mentioned earlier is that my identical twins grew up to set up a YouTube channel that became very successful. And initially it was just fun. And it was, fun films in which they appeared and travelled. And then they both had a kind of crisis of, what is this all about? They were very successful. And one went away to study Finn architecture, and the other kind of just stopped doing it. He just thought he had a total crisis of this is just about nothing. And how they both came back into social media and set up this platform, Earthrise, which is doing very well, and the YouTube channel was relaunched, is to think what's worth talking about is environmental issues, and to draw in and galvanise our generation to become activists in however they see fit. And it was at that time Jack joined Extinction Rebellion and ended up being arrested and going to court. So that was part of a whole call for citizen engagement, wasn't it, basically? So I had never intended an Al-Qaeda thing. I didn't intend to radicalise them. That was just an unintended... Because I never spoke to them about the issues, but they obviously absorbed the fact that you can roll up your sleeves and go out there and do something.
Once Upon a Time in Ibiza with Alex Gray.
The wings of karma cover my breath like a cloak of love. I fly the vortex, the void, the cosmic highway above. A metamorphosis of beingness, a constant flux of my soul, an eternal transformation of life itself. I arrive, naked, a woman. My womb of fire, spinning webs of intelligence. I am the dancer, the weaver, the painter of desire. Screaming, dreaming, forgetting the remembering. They noticed my hips. They considered my lips. They do not see the truth in me. They only see my awe and wonder, shadow and light, the dark side of the moon rising for the fight. Hashtag me too, hashtag vote. Save the planet, stop the war. Did you get that? Take note. Marching, starving, fighting for my right, a right to have my voice heard, to be seen in the light. I was born with agency, purpose, a quest. Ancient history, no mystery, I will rise without rest. My trailblazing inconvenience, what will you do? A woman of substance is unravelling you. The lifelong dance of the patriarchal trance, the matriarchal foxtrot paparazzi dare not glance. I will not be silenced or locked up in my house. I have divine feminine power, a mission. I ride a tiger, not a mouse. I arrive on the battlefield, my skin laid bare. Truth is my weapon, I do not easily scare. Have faith in my nature, I will journey to the end. For the mothers, the lovers, the sisters, the friends. I will relentlessly tread this path of justice. It's all woven in the story. I stand rooted with the tree of life as we rise humanity to its glory. You see me fall, you see me rise. Do not mistake my truth for lies. This is the revolution of the heart. This has been the mission before the horse and cart. Do not deny my allies. Do not mock my waver. I am not here for the reckoning of female misbehaviour. I am here for the children, for the living and the dead. Today we change the heart of things. No more words. Enough said.
I think what I like about the Earthrise projects, amongst many other things, is the fact that, they believe in the power of storytelling to shape new perspectives. And I think that, that clearly comes from you being their mum. The fact that you managed to do all of that storytelling whilst having 3 children and making a multitude of novels, books, screenplays and all the activism that you've actually managed to achieve as well is nothing short of, quite incredible. So hats off to you. It sounds like you've been quite busy, Rebecca. But I think it's the story of our time, this eco-anxiety. We've talked about it on the podcast before, and I think, I'd be interested. Obviously, I know that Jack's gone off to Iceland to make this this documentary or series for YouTube. And I think it's interesting maybe from your perspective to find out what your biggest eco-anxiety is at almost 60 compared to perhaps the boys who are feeling like, maybe slightly different elements of that eco-anxiety.
Such a big question, isn't it? I think that, of course, I have less time ahead of me, and so I will be witnessing less of the changes that are coming down the line. I am deeply invested as a parent, though, in that future that I won't actually see myself. And I hope, it becomes a crisis for people whether to have children. And so I just have to... I have to have faith that with this awareness and with this, what is becoming a rapid change to renewable energy, we are making a systems change. We're in what Joanna Macy, the great Buddhist writer, calls the Great Turning. We are in the Great Turning. I have to hold into that. The question is, is the Great Turning going to be quick enough and substantial enough? So I think that I don't know that I'm typical. I think I share the level of anxiety that my own children have because I've been so involved in the field. I think on the whole, my generation stands a little bit back from it. And the thing that most enrages me is when people of my generation say it's down to my kids' generation to sort it out. That really, I mean, talk about letting yourself off the hook. I do not see it in that way. In fact, I think completely the opposite. I think, if you're in your 40s, 50s and 60s, you are the decision makers who pull out your finger and start contributing to the system's change, and don't be looking to the millennials. Work with the millennials, and the millennials are coming through, and I think things will change very radically as they start to reach their power bases. So I share their terror, and I've had to work, to be honest, on it in therapy, and I do meditation, and I've just set up a regenerative farm, which is a more hope-filled way of contributing to the issue.
I'm quite intrigued about the farm, so we'll get into that in a sec. But, let's talk about the book first that you've just written called Heatwave, which is obviously based in Ibiza, and I really enjoyed reading it. I'm still only halfway through. I've really tried to make a lot of time to squeeze reading in, which is kind of feels like a bit of a luxury these days to actually sit down with a good book. And I did a little bit of that on holiday recently, but I really did enjoy the first half. I love the descriptions, obviously, of Ibiza and the countryside and the campo and the plants and the vegetation and the permaculture projects. We've talked about wildfires. We've talked about desalination plants, which was absolute gold, talking about the fact that I had no idea that the three on the island are owned by the Matutas family, which was interesting as well. And it's obviously there's a lot of crisis on this island in terms of the way certain systems operate and functioning in quite an old system that needs a good old update. And water is one of the biggest crises that we do face, as well as importation of food, which is obviously linked to the other project that you're creating. But I like the way that you kind of wove those storylines into a really great, interesting novel, which was kind of partly fiction. I could kind of see potential elements of your own storyline there as well. Is that true?
There is a collage, always writing as a collage. The characters are all composites of people I know on the island, absolutely, for sure. It's a story told from 4 perspectives. And it hopefully has a strong emotional arc of a complex family story, which is unpacked like the layers of an onion. But it also is the environmental story of Ibiza, as you say. And it pulls no punches on that story, but I'm partly in doing so not just telling the story of Ibiza, because what's happening in Ibiza is a microcosm of a macrocosm, as you know. So the fact that we are not husbanding our water here and the water's running out, the fact that the island is importing. When I began my regenerative work, I thought we were importing in Ibiza 3% of our food. It's actually 1%. Is insane, and that story is duplicated across the world. So the book is kind of telling a microcosm of a macro, and the book is about moral myopia. It's about what we know but we turn our minds from. And I think that the systems change can only come when more people actually attend to what they know, because, as I said earlier, we do know now. Everyone knows. We have no excuse. So what's happening on this island, as I'm sure you know, and anyone listening is aware, is this very exciting regenerative movement which is coming through with great vibrancy and speed. So there was a generation that moved off the land. Of course, Ibizencos, even 60, 70 years ago, all had their small holdings. And it was a perfect sustainable paradigm, right? They built their houses from the rocks on their land, from the sabinas. They made the roofs from the sabinas. They covered them in the calc from the land. And they had their pig that they slaughtered once a year with their neighbours. And they made their olive oil from their trees. Everything was there. And it kind of went through when the airport was put in and tourism came in the 1970s. It went through this mini industrial revolution, and it was much easier. These were tough lives, not to romanticize them, and they had a lot of starvation, and a lot of young people went abroad to find work, as you know. And so suddenly there were all these jobs in tourism, and people abandoned their land. So what we're surrounded by is I don't know sadly what the percentage, but very high percentage of abandoned farmland. And what land was being farmed, they started to use, as they were across the world, fertilizers, chemical fertilizers and chemical pesticides, and got into this terrible cycle because it seemed to produce some miraculous food. It seemed the modern way, and degrade this beautiful soil. And so what has happened now with this dawning awareness that we need to change our food systems specifically is, Ibiza's always been interesting in being forward-looking. So it had, from the hippie culture, which was, against the Vietnam War, and had all the elements of the environmental movement, actually, but maybe in a more personal sense. A lot of people started to set up the old ways of farming, of permaculture, of only, of planting with the waxing and waning of the moon, of never leaving the earth bare. So I had been trying to make a documentary about rewilding for a few years, and I couldn't get it off the ground, but I learnt a lot, and I started to look for land here to rewild. And then I came across this derelict farm very close to where I was living, and it had been a small holding, and it had just been left. In fact, it was in a huge fire zone, so it was regenerating. That it was part of the very big fire that happened in 2011, where I think Ibiza lost 7% of its farmland, land and forests. And so it was a perfect opportunity. So the pine trees had all been burnt to the ground. So instead of allowing all of them to return, we were taking out a lot and replacing them with a wider diversity of native trees, because the pine tree creates a monoculture and a very acid environment underneath them, which is difficult for things to grow. So putting in thousands of oaks, thousands of fruit trees, thousands of olive trees. Not that the olive trees were bought by the Romans, so it's quite complicated what is native. And it has a spring, so it was also about let's bring in technologies to husband this water really well, and use it as a kind of paradigm project along with the other farms that are all evolving, where people can come and see and smell and taste and get what regenerative farming looks like. And although we've literally only just finished renovating the farm building, it's 300,000 square metres of land, so that's probably a lifelong project. And we just that we're about to bring in sheep. And by the way, as I said to you before we started, I'm born and bred in a city, so I'm learning a lot fast. It's really exciting, heart-lifting work to do. And it's so wonderful to see all the other farms springing up, and so there's a regenerative WhatsApp group, and we're exchanging information, asking questions of each other, borrowing equipment on it all the time, and more people are joining every month, and it's a real vibrant energy about the whole thing.
I think it's really positive, and I think we just hear, as we've just talked about, so much about the eco-anxiety and the world is doomed and we're all going to die by, a certain decade that's kind of already mapped out in our future, and we're kind of almost, pummeled with this idea that it's too late and we can't do anything about it. And that's why I love this regen idea on the island that seems to be spreading like wildfire, and so it should be. That is the answer to all of this, is to turn that desertified soil into incredible rich land again, just like it used to be, as you said. And I think that's very, very important, because when you look around and all the tilled earth and all the kind of dusty kind of wasteland is quite sad. I mean, there's not that much of it. I think there was a lot more not that long ago, but it feels like there's a real, as you said, a movement carrying on. And I feel like it feels like the positive story of the island right now. I think there's been such examination in the last 2 years of exactly what this island is up to and how things really are. And that's a beautiful thing, that the island has been laid to rest really for 2 years from this vast influx that we have every summer. So it's going to be interesting, I think, to see what will unfold this summer. But, definitely behind the scenes, as you've said, there's this amazing group of people that are really working incredibly hard to give, life back to the earth. And I think that that's a really amazing story, and really kind of offsets this negative kind of climate change story that we're all kind of ingesting on a daily basis, that I don't think is necessarily that helpful, because there's so much that we still can do, but the hope story isn't the one that we're kind of, being kind of made aware of in the same kind of way. So I'm very excited about this new regen project. You've obviously been, as you say, working hard to get that off the ground and to learn a lot. And I think that, the great thing through that is that more people on the island will learn in turn. What, with the book, what's the plan for it? I mean, when is it actually coming out?
So the book is kind of another way of disseminating the message. I mean, the theme, I suppose, of what we're discussing is how you use storytelling to raise awareness of social issues. And I suppose that is at the heart of what I try to do and what excites me. So this tells a potent environmental story. You have to get to the end to discover what happens. So I actually think what I'm going to do is there are these new models of publishing. And I'm working, I'm just about in the process of talking to a company about basically self-publishing it and distributing it on the island. There's a wonderful book called My Ibiza. She was born and bred in the island, so she wrote and illustrated this sort of beautiful love song really to the island. So she basically distributes that book herself. So the models are changing. So I think I'm going to try that, and I would like to give some of the proceeds to the Ibiza Preservation Fund. So that's partly what I'm here to do, actually, is have all these meetings and to set that up. But I think what's interesting about Ibiza is it's a kind of, it's an experimental base to spread the word across the world. People are very interested in what happens in Ibiza. So if the book did find an audience here, I would be looking to distribute it internationally. And I think that what the regenerative movement is doing here is hopefully going to create systems change elsewhere, because there just is, as you know, more than anyone, this perpetual fascination with what happens here. So I think it's very well placed to be part of a wider systems change. It's not just about one small island and that small community.
I think also what I liked about the book from what I've consumed thus far was the fact that you were a little bit cheeky with kind of alluding to this kind of kind of crowd that come from Europe and sort of buy up properties and maybe don't, think far in advance enough about what it is they're going to be doing here and how they're going to be building and how they're going to create the swimming pool and what that water or where that water is going to come from and, all of these elements of food supply and, exactly how to treat the earth that surrounds their great big fat finger and everything else that goes with it. And there's just, you put it beautifully, I think, in terms of there's a slight through the family of Alice that she obviously rediscovers through the course of the story. They are obviously living a very opulent and affluent life. And, it's good to shine a light on the fact that, there's an influx that comes here every summer, not just from, tourism, but also people that come to live here. And it's always been a pirate island and an island of people travelling through or close by. And, that's attracted like a very transient group of people, which means that a lot of those properties are then left, for vast periods of the year where people can't actually come here as well, particularly from England anymore. And that's, an interesting thing, because what happens to that land and how is it taken care of? And those are all the things that really do need to be thought about before you just come and buy a property here. You need to think about like how that is going to be a sustainable idea moving forward. And I think that's what one of the storylines I really liked was the cheeky kind of you kind of got stuck the old knife in there a few times.
No, well, I can't deny that. I mean, I'm hoping to use humour. I always like that as a way of softening, certainly it has social satire. But I think when you read that the top 2% of the world's wealthy population are producing 20-something% of our carbon emissions, I mean, that is a moral crisis, right? So I think that it's not about finger wagging, but it's just about enough moral myopia. If you have kids, if you have nephews, if you have nieces, if you see kids in the street, do you really not think that it's time to assess what your carbon footprint is, to really think through the moral consequences of the things that you think you want and need? And you're so well placed to be funding tree planting schemes. I mean, whatever it is you decide to do that is giving back to the planet, do it because you have the means. And on this island you do get great extremes, as you're saying, and you have people with, jaw-droppingly deep pockets. And I think with that should come a profound degree of social responsibility. And there are some individuals like that on the island, and they are part of the regenerative movement, and all credit to them. They have my greatest respect, but I would like to prick a few consciences.
Are you going to go down to the private jet runway and do a little protest picnic this summer.
I love that idea. Maybe sell my book. God, yes. I don't have small children to bring anymore. But maybe if someone would lend me some small children, because it needs that sort of, no, that's a great idea. Will you come with me?
I was just about to say that. Let's make it a podcast protest picnic.
Let's do a live broadcast on the spot. Seriously, I'm actually serious. I'm gonna be calling you about this. Let's do it. I mean, that's exactly. I think also what happens is, you say, that when people become overwhelmed by this issue, when they become demoralised, all your campaigning spirit comes out of you. You just, you go to ground. We all become ostriches. So I think if we can find the ways of creating action by being a bit more playful with it. I mean, it's a dark issue, but one of my sons has a very good way of dealing with it, and he has really struggled with his mental health because of it. There's something called the adaptive cycle. And if anyone wants to read about the adaptive cycle, it's in essence, and I'm going to really mangle it in my explanation, it's about how we have throughout human history gone through these periods of crisis. And out of the crisis, we adapt and we create these solutions. And you can make this sort of wave graph of it. And that we are in the process of one of those adaptive cycles in which we have plunged into darkness, and now very, very fast and quickly very good brains are thinking about renewables and different ways of, I mean, for example, carbon. If you get carbon out of the air where it's a disaster and into the ground, it's a fantastic force for good. So that's so beautifully simple. And just think about that. Anyone who hears the idea, just think about the consequence. How do I work with that idea? How can I help get carbon out of the air into the ground? It's kind of really simple in a way. So you and I, let's lead the way of a bit of direct action on this island.
I mean, it's crossed my mind a few times, but I'm like, I'm not sure if I fancy going down there on my own and getting arrested. But if you're up for it, let's do it.
Without a shadow of a doubt.
I think we'll end it there, Rebecca. I'm so grateful for your time. I'm really excited for this Regen project and the hub. I think I heard a rumour that it might be called
the Regenerative Hub. I think you said it was called.
Something like that, yeah. The Regen Hub, somewhere not too far from here where we are on the island. And I just think there's just so much positivity, and clearly you've got like many more stories to tell on the island. I don't think the book is more than just the tip of the iceberg, really, judging from the amount of projects that you have produced up until now.
Well, thank you so much. Maybe we can come back, or let's meet again on the runway just outside the private jet terminal.
I'll see you there.
See you there.
It was the Ibiza podcast of Gang of Witches, hosted by Joe Yule. See you at the next new moon. Until then, take care of yourselves. Ciao.
I'm calling upon my witches everywhere, my witches everywhere. I'm calling upon my sisters everywhere.